Hello everybody, this is Foreign Office with Alexandr Domrin, and we have a very special guest in our studio today, Israel Shamir, a prolific writer and a scholar. I have a pleasure to know him personally, and I was so pleased when we invited him to our studio and he agreed to come to our program. Hello, welcome.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Could you please tell us a few words about your books? Because I know that you have published several of them, and actually you have been publishing your books in different languages, including Russian. And well, I would like to recommend your books, of course, to our viewers.
Well, let's say, if in English, my last book was a collection of essays that was called The Masters of Discourse. But if you look in the Amazon, you'll find more of them. That's basically political writing.
Mm-hmm. One of those topics that is of a big interest to me is freedom of speech.
Yes.
And the First Amendment, of course, is the First Amendment to the American Constitution, is the First Amendment in the so-called Bill of Rights, which is a kind of a sacred cow. But quite often when I visit the United States of America, I have this feeling that, number one, the freedom of speech in America is very limited, and number two, American mass media is very politicized. Am I right?
Well, you know, about freedom of speech, what does it actually mean? Everybody, everywhere, is free to say whatever one wants. But the question is of consequences. What will happen to this person after he says what he wants to say? And my friend Noam Chomsky used to say a very important thing about freedom of speech as it is known in the United States. Everybody is obviously free to say what he wants. But if the person says things which are not expected for him to say, next time we hear from him, he works as a taxi driver in New Jersey.
Noam Chomsky, of course, is another great hero for many of us here in Russia. And I remember another expression that I heard, not from Noam Chomsky, but from one of my friends. To be correct, to be right, is not an excuse yet.
Absolutely, that's very true. But what is interesting is that Russia is probably the most free country I personally ever experienced. Here, there is a freedom of speaking against the government, against Putin personally. Not only speaking, you can say most awful things against the government in Russia. You can publish it in a newspaper or in a magazine more than anywhere else that I know of. Well, I know people who are in strict opposition to the government in the United States too, but if they would say things that are that strictly against the existing order, they will be surely living in a trailer in North Carolina, far away from the main road, and exist from selling chicken. And I speak in reality. That's exactly what happens with people who are in a strict and open opposition to the regime as it exists in the United States. Otherwise, you have to really conform. In Russia, it's in a way, it's also a result of what happened here in the 1990s. It is still a country with exceeding freedom of speech.
Speaking about politicized Western mass media, I have an old issue of The New Yorker, a very popular American magazine. It was published on the 1st of March, 2010, exactly 5 years ago. And one particular article that I would like to quote is about the victory of Victor Yanukovich in free and democratic elections in Ukraine exactly 5 years ago. Yanukovych was praised by American mass media, well, this is one of those examples, because The New Yorker indeed is a very popular American magazine, as you know. And one of those reasons why his victory was so praised by American mass media in general and by The New Yorker in particular is, quote, "The 2010 presidential election was the first in which Ukrainians born after independence could vote." My point here is that exactly 4 years after that, we remember Victoria Nuland. We remember Maidan. We remember the coup in Ukraine, when American mass media began writing absolutely opposite to what it was writing just 4 years before. Isn't it unusual? Were you surprised? I was not.
No, nor was I, nor was I. I also felt that, you know, there is a French word, dirigiste, directed media, and that is what it is. American media and media of Western Europe as well is basically strictly controlled. It is strictly controlled on, from two sides, from the left and from the right. They arrive to the same point, but by totally different roads. For instance, when the forces that decide to bomb a country, they do it from two different directions. The rightists say it should be done for the glory, that should be done for profits, it should be done because those guys are bad guys for this or other way. And the left side is arriving to the same position by saying that it has to be done because women or gays are mistreated. So they create two different narratives, but they arrive to the same very point. And that is obviously a very interesting invention of the West. I wrote about it in my last book in English, that was The Masters of Discourse, where I said that in the West there are people who rule the discourse, the whole of discourse, its left and its right side, and both of them arrive to the same very place.
And it doesn't really matter who is in power, the Democrats or the Republicans. Basically, well, the story is the same all the time.
Yes, we saw it yesterday, yesterday, 3rd of March. Whenever you will watch this thing, maybe it wouldn't be yesterday, but it will still remain March 3rd. That is time when Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu went to visit the American Congress. And it's something that will be worth to see when all the Congress, senators and congressmen stood up on their feet and applauded for 6 or 7 long minutes for the foreign prime minister entering the House of Representatives. That's something you could see, really, it's worth to see, like you see people who is in there, let's say, people who expect that is the ruler who is coming in, not Obama, who was mistreated, and actually the very appearance of Netanyahu was against Obama. Obama was actually the target of his appearance, but let's say the true ruler as those people felt he is.
We definitely recommend our viewers to find this episode on YouTube and watch it. Well, another important event has just happened. I speak about assassination of Boris Nemtsov. And of course, well, we have just discussed this detail with you that, listen, we have freedom of speech in Russia. We had freedom of expression. Were you surprised? We don't really know who was the organizer of that assassination, but immediately Western mass media began publishing stories, including stories on front pages of newspapers, that a critic of the Kremlin was assassinated, as if it can be the only possible explanation. That's number one. And number two, as if the Kremlin indeed is someone who is behind that assassination. I was in America. I was teaching in America in the fall of 2006 when Anna Politkovskaya was killed, when she was murdered. And I remember absolutely identical accusations. Moreover, she was murdered. It was the birthday of President Putin. So how can it be? It cannot be a coincidence. It was definitely Putin behind that assassination. We hear this story again and again. I have this feeling that sometimes my Western friends, including my American friends, they have too short memory, or they don't want just to follow the story.
That is a great thing about American media, that they know who did what before the dust went down. You remember 9/11. nobody knew yet what happens, and they already said, well, that's done by the Arab Muslim terrorists. And then they built up immediately things. They found the passport immediately, despite destruction where the houses collapsed and where the plane was burned down, but the immaculate, perfect passports remained whole. They could find them. And the same thing now, I am amazed. Well, you know, Russia, as I say, it's a country where things are not functioning very well. If such an occasion would happen in the United States, I am sure they would find a car that Nemtsov was shot from, and they would find their passport of Vladimir Putin. So that's in a way his luck, that it's not searched by American police, and passport or driving license of Putin is not there. Yes, that's obviously a ridiculous thing. Let's say assassination of Nemtsov, it has, let's say, two very different stories behind it. One for external, one for internal consumption. For external consumption, actually, everything that was done worked perfectly fine. Indeed, a picture with St. Basil Cathedral, a beautiful cathedral, and the Red Square, and the Kremlin, and the place where he was killed, including the mysterious Ukrainian beauty that accompanied him. Let's say it was absolutely perfect picture. And then it's obviously not difficult to say, well, that was done by Putin. You know, everything evil that is being done, that's done by him, he personally. He is so demonized that it's just amazing. But let's say for internal consumption, one would expect to get a bit more mileage, that the enemies of Russia would get more mileage out of it, and they didn't. Obviously, in Russia, one would expect. The government really had absolutely no reason whatsoever to kill Nemtsov. Nemtsov was a nice person, a has-been as a politician. His, let's say, moments of glory were all of them in 1990s, some kind of 15 years ago, or more than that. Since then, he lived a life of hedonist, enjoying himself, a womanizer. I say that without a desire to say something nasty about guys. You can say many things much worse about a man, that he enjoys a female company, so he did. And anyway, that was a man who basically enjoyed himself. Being an ex-prime minister or something like that, he was always invited to all kinds of events by opposition, and he probably considered himself still a politician, but he was not a very active politician, and being very soft man by his character, he had no great enemies, neither in Kremlin nor anywhere else. He was, let's say, probably an ideal opposition man. He would never be able to rally opposition. He was not a man that people liked especially much. Nobody cared about him all that much. So that's why for us who are in Moscow, it's quite impossible to imagine, even for a second, that pro-government forces would like to kill him because he was dangerous for somebody, because he was not. He was totally harmless guy.
He was benign. He was a has-been. You're absolutely right in this. And of course, I absolutely agree with you that the least interested people, the least interested parties in this assassination is Russia, the Russians, and Putin.
Right, one would expect, you know, let's say a couple of years ago, when Russia went through a spot of unrest, at that time, one would think if such an event would happen then, one could expect that when there were a lot of passion, people would come to the place where he was killed, within reach from Kremlin. They would be able to go forward, to break through the police, to try to storm Kremlin, to try to make a violent revolution, to do something. or at least to arrange a Maidan at Tahrir, as we would say, you know, something similar to what happened in Cairo or in Kiev.
Right.
And nothing of this sort happened. A lot of people, 30,000, maybe 50,000, marched to say him farewell after his death, and it went very, very peacefully. There was no special much police that would interfere with it. People went really peacefully, quietly, without much of excitement. Mm-hmm. So I would say internally, it really had very, very little impact by whoever did it. They didn't succeed to use it at all. Mm-hmm. And that's why some people in Moscow, when they try to understand who could do such a thing, they say it probably was inspired by the people in Washington. You know, they have a book of Gene Sharp that they use as their guidelines, and it says, well, you know, if a leader, if nothing works, well, kill a leader of your opposition movement, then you have a martyr, then you, with this martyr you go and break somewhere. So in a way one feels it's like they use the book of Sharp as their guidelines, but it didn't work at all. He was not specially touching, and his very melodramatic, very picturesque death near Kremlin was not really something that would cause people a lot of aggravation. Mm-hmm.
We have time for one more question. I remember both of us participated in a really interesting conference, which was held at the very end of August last year. It was in Yalta, in the Crimea.
Yes.
It was dedicated to the events in Donbass. It was dedicated to Russian-Ukrainian relations. And my last question, what would you recommend? What sources of information would you recommend to our English-speaking viewers so that they could understand better what's happening in Russia, what's happening in Ukraine, and what's happening in the world from our point of view?
Well, let's say I personally like most of all the Counterpunch, which is counterpunch.org, which I think is one of the best sites. It's also all round. They have everything. They have Russia, Middle East, whatever you like. And it's also not too much articles every day because many others would have too much. And so that would be my first preference. And the second one would be probably Global Research, which is a Canadian site, but also a very good one. And for people who are reading French, I would advise Voltaire, network, which is also very good. That is, let's say, the most important networks.
Thank you very much for your really interesting interview. We're always pleased to see you here when you're in Moscow. And please be our guest again. Just let us know when you're around.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So this is the end of our program today. It was Foreign Office with Alexander Domrin. Please stay tuned.